There is a very important passage to begin our discussion of our relationship with law enforcement. It's Romans 13 and verse 1. It says there, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers. For there is no power but of God, and the powers that be are ordained of God." And yet that's a difficult passage to put into play and into practice when we read such names as Rashard Brooks, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Botham Jean, Eric Garner, Philando Castile, Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, and many, many more. These are just ones in our recent years of remembrance. Those who have lost their life at the hands of law enforcement. And so, what is the Bible's challenge, encouragement, instruction to us as we interact with law enforcement? I believe that is given to us in three parts. Today we'll look at the first. We'll look at prayer. And the next we'll look at is using our rights, or really working our rights. The third one is having committed conversations. Now, prayer is significant because it allows a power that is greater than us to come into play and to experience and to challenge and to have us experience what it means to see God at work in relationships that many times can be very challenging. The passage I'd like to turn your attention to is 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 1. There we read, "First of all, then, I urge you that entreaties and prayers and petitions and thanksgivings be made on behalf of all men, for kings and all who are in authority, so that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity." That we may live a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. For that goal, then, we are challenged to make sure that we pray. And Paul is so serious about that he uses multiple terms for prayer. Entreaties is the first one, and it means that please, 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 God, move in a powerful way. And then there is prayer, which has the idea of conversation and interaction with God. Then the next term is petitions, which means to list off the carrying of a group of ideas and desires to God. And then it ends up with thanksgiving. And thanksgiving is very significant because that comes at the end of this section because it gives us hope. It removes that thought that our prayers don't matter. Because thanksgiving, as it says in Colossians chapter 4 and verse 2, we are to devote ourselves with prayer, always being fervent in it with an attitude of thanksgiving. That means we are seeing God at work. We're looking for his work, the good things he's doing, even in our relationships with those who challenge us, noting that God is at work, therefore he will be at work. And so that is how we then live in a context in which the mission and purpose that God has for us will be achieved. In tranquility, living out lives in dignity and holiness, and making sure that his message goes out. And so if that is to occur, we are to be about prayer. Now that's a challenging passage because as you note its context, you realize that Paul is writing this at a time where one of the cruelest and most anti-Christian rulers ever existed. His name was Nero, Emperor Nero of Rome. He who burned Rome and then blamed Christians for it, and then later on burned Christians in his garden to light it up. Then later on fed Christians to beasts in the Colosseum. And finally, one of his greatest acts is to kill Peter and Paul, those great apostles of the faith. So when Paul challenges us to pray, he removes all of our excuses, all of our arguments that we can't pray because this is an institution, law enforcement, that over time and its history in America has in many ways been used as an arm for a racist policy and for keeping African Americans in their place and for really continuing a racist approach. We can't say that has been the case and therefore we cannot pray for them. No, not at all. The Bible challenges us to pray. And it challenges us to pray in such a way that we realize God can change and move lives. That was the prayer for Nero, that God would change his heart, that God would transform his world, that God would eventually even bring justice through him. So that must be our prayer as well, that God would change the hearts of those who are in this great profession, that God would transform their world, that God would allow them to bring true justice. And so as we are challenged in that way, we are to be about praying. We ought to be about praying that God would move in any and all ways, that if there are any biases, that would be arrested and no longer have impact upon the lives of these law enforcement individuals that have contact with the community. We ought to be praying that as they move towards a car, it's been said that in the first 7 seconds, there are actions that will take place that will change the life of the officer or could change the life of those who are behind that wheel. And so we are to be praying that God would bless, God would guide, God would lead, and God would transform these lives. And so that's our first step. I hope you'll join us in the next video as we look at what more there is to come.